Welcome everyone to our youth-led event ahead of the G20 Leaders Summit this weekend. Thank you for joining us. I am Winnie Nyendiga, Africa Regional Organizer for the 100 Million campaign, and I'll be one of your moderators today alongside my amazing co-moderator, Georgia. The youth activists, survivor advocates, and student leaders uniting here today are sending a clear message to the leaders of the world's richest countries. Your hoarding of global wealth and resources, especially during the devastating COVID-19 pandemic, has resulted in a catastrophic child and youth rights crisis in the world's poorest countries. Despite the nice words of building back together, we are all in this together, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the lack of international support and true solidarity has meant that 150 million of us I have to repeat that again. 150 million more of us entered multidimensional poverty in 2020. 46 million more of us could become child laborers between 2020 and the end of 2022. 128 million of us are still forced out of education by lockdowns, and 258 million of us have never been to school at all. And the 34.6 million of us who have been displaced have been put at a greater risk of child labor and trafficking, child marriage, and violence. This unprecedented rise in the worst injustices against children and young people did not happen suddenly or without warning. Millions and millions of us knew this was going to happen and pleaded with governments to prevent the loss of a generation. To remind us how, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator for today's event, Georgia.
Thank you, Winnie, and thank you to everyone for joining us here today. As Winnie said, I'm the lead of activism at Million, and I'm very grateful to you all for joining us. Now, Winnie's right. Over the past 2 years, young people have been on the front lines of demanding those already marginalised receive their fair share of support, protection during COVID-19. Many of our speakers and audience today have already been part of this collective fight. From our joint campaign backed by representatives of over 1 billion young people around the world calling for justice for every child, launched at the outset of the pandemic, to the call for a fair share for children that was backed by over 80 Nobel laureates and world leaders. Together, we have been relentless in demanding action from those in seats of power. In fact, at last year's G20, 100 youth representatives from over 46 countries issued a joint question to the G20 leaders. As world leaders taking responsibility for the global response to COVID, will you take responsibility for the world's most marginalised children? Ultimately, the answer we've heard is no. Despite some positive steps by some countries increasing their aid, overall action from the world's richest countries have been too little. But as this event will try to show, hopefully, it's not too late to reverse this tide of injustice. Now, over the next, just going to bring my co-moderator back with me. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to hear directly from the incredible youth activists, survivor advocates, and student leaders who have been working tirelessly to protect the rights of the most vulnerable, both during and before the pandemic. We're hoping for a more informal structure today. We're going to have 3 short discussions exploring the impact the lack of international support has had on children and young people forced to work as child labourers, children and young people living in emergencies and protracted crises, and children and young people denied their education. Now, please be sure to join our conversation. You can put your comments or questions to any of our speakers on our YouTube or Facebook channel, wherever you're watching from, or you can join along in the conversation online by using the hashtag FairShareForChildren. So over to you, Winnie, to introduce our first discussion.
Thanks, Georgia. Our first discussion is a timely one. So 2021 was designated by the United Nations as the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor. Yet, it is also the year that the ILO announced that even before the pandemic, child labor had already risen from 152 million in 2016 to 106 million at the start of 2020. Let me repeat, a rise of almost 10 million children forced to work before COVID. Worst still, the largest rise is amongst the youngest children, where progress has already reversed. With 16.8 million more 5 to 11-year-olds in child labor than in 2016, the first year of the SDGs. How can this happen when at the same time the wealth of the world increased by over 10% and the wealth of billionaires by over 25%? Where are our priorities? To discuss this, we have joining us today Whitney Ebo, who's the Programs Officer, Survivors Network Cameroon, who works to support children and young people experiencing child labor, trafficking, and modern slavery. Our second speaker, Medna Saran, a member of the National Campaign Group at 100 Million US and the founder Touch of Life Foundation. And then our third speaker is Emebo Iradukunda, Fair Share Campaign Lead and also the Executive Secretary of the Burundi National Students Union. Welcome, friends. Whitney, over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am Ebod Winita, survivor of trafficking. I am a staff at Survivors Network. I am delighted to be amongst you today. What greater evidence do we need to efforts to eliminate child labor and human trafficking are failing? Today, over half of the world's population consists of young children who are vulnerable and are moving into poverty and child labor at an unprecedented rate. In the UN Year for the Elimination of Child Labor, 92.2 million of us are now 92.2 million of children are now facing child labor, with over 86.6 million living in the sub-Saharan Africa. Africa is now home to more child laborers than the rest of the world. Now more than ever, we are at risk of child labor, child marriages, and violence, being excluded from education, fleeing at homes as refugees and IDPs. These injustices are happening at a time when global wealth has reached all at a high time. The ongoing crisis in the English-speaking regions of Cameroon has led to the displacement of more than 2,000 young people in the pursuit of safety as they are being trafficked by the family members, and they are forced to work on the streets, in churches, in markets, and in bus stations. Some are forced to work as domestic servants, where they are risks of being sexually violated by their employers due to their vulnerability. 40% of the displaced population in Cameroon are children and young people. Lockdowns and school closures and rising instability due to the crisis continue to increase our risks and vulnerability of being trafficked as children. Notably, The number of child laborers in displaced camps and host communities has increased since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Since the G20's positioned itself as a focal point for the support of children and young people who are suffering from, I'm sorry, since sorry, since the G20 positions itself as a focal point for the response to COVID-19, very little has been done. If the support for the children and young people suffering from worse injustices during the pandemic had not been done on a rapid rate, we risk losing a whole generation. At Survivors Network, SN Cameroon, we are a youth-led organization that advocates against human trafficking and modern-day slavery in all its forms. Today, we are joining youth activists, survivors, survivors advocates, and student leaders who have been working tirelessly to protect the rights of the most vulnerable, both before and during the pandemic. To add to our critical voice, to amplify our collaborate, to amplify our collective call for justice to end child labor. Therefore, I urge the G20s swing into action. It is not too little. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Whitney. Asking the G20 to swing into action. It is not too late. Medna, over to you.
Already. Hello, everyone. My name is Maidna Sarin, and I'm a 100 million youth activist and the co-founder of the Touch of Life Foundation to combat human trafficking and child labor. Imagine a daily routine where you have to wake up at the crack of dawn to work grueling jobs in brutal condition for little money and with no future prospects for success. Now imagine that worker is a young child. Sadly, this grim scenario is an unfortunate reality for millions of children worldwide. According to the International Labor Organization, 160 million children are engaged in child labor, and in recent years, this number has dramatically increased. This is 11% of our world's children without social protection. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, poorer communities have been facing record-breaking levels of inequality and poverty, with children being affected the most. Between 2015 and 2019, global wealth grew by over $10 trillion, but the number of child laborers aged 5 to 11 increased by 10,000 every day. This statistic is alarming, and we need our world leaders to implement strong social protection programs and commit to it. With this being a priority, we can prevent, lessen, and stop the number of child laborers from growing. The 2020 U.S. Census reported that poverty rates have fallen to an astounding 9.1%, the lowest rate on record, and there's been a 40% cut in child poverty. This implementation has lifted 8.5 million people out of poverty and is largely attributed to stimulus payments, a form of social protection in the U.S. If continued and made permanent, child poverty rates could be cut in half. With the United States social protection success, I'm urging the G20 to do more social protection work in each of their own countries and for donor nations to give foreign assistance and make them specifically targeted for social protection in recipient countries. Lastly, in 1930, the United States passed the Tariff Act, which prohibited products from being made with child labor. However, there was an exception that if there was a high demand, child labor could be used. This loophole was only closed in 2016. While the U.S. has finally closed the loophole in the Tariff Act, rules and implementation have not been happening fast enough. The U.S. is far behind many of its G20 colleagues, and there needs to be a national, regional human right, and environmental law due diligence. A change needs to be made. Thank you so much for listening to me speak today.
Thank you so much, Medna. Emebo, I can see you're here. Over to you.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm the French speaker, so I can say it in French. So, my name is Emma Biadukunde. I'm the Secretary Executive of the Union Student Union, and I was within the campaign of Chareba Affair. So, let me use French. En principe, les enfants ont le droit d'aller à l'école sans discrimination et doivent être protégés contre la violence et les mauvais traitements et toute forme d'abus et d'exploitation. Cependant, ce n'est pas la réalité au Burundi et certainement pas en Afrique. Le travail et la traite des enfants se sont accélérés en Afrique au cours des 8 dernières années. Nous abritons désormais plus d'enfants travailleurs que le reste du monde réuni. Les statistiques montrent que 86 millions, donc 0,6 millions d'enfants travaillent et vivent en Afrique subsaharienne, ce qui est étonnant. Il est choquant de constater que l'Organisation internationale du travail prévoit que l'absence des interventions sérieuses, 8,9 millions d'enfants supplémentaires pourraient être contraints de travailler d'ici à la fin de l'année 2022 en raison de la pandémie mondiale. Si nous ne pensons pas à l'action, cela signifierait que les progrès ont reculé d'une décennie. Au Burundi, l'article 10 du Code de travail du Burundi stipule que l'âge minimum d'admission à l'emploi est fixé à 16 ans. Cependant, nos enfants les plus pauvres, âgés à peine de 5 ans, sont inscrits de l'éducation et surtout, ils sont désormais employés comme domestiques. On observe ça la plupart dans les villes. L'extrême pauvreté sont assez au système de protection sociale, y compris les planchers, et la pandémie du COVID-19 ont accéléré le niveau des injustices. Pourtant, il est évident que l'obtention d'une part équitable des ressources, des politiques de la protection sociale de chaque enfant au Burundi et plus largement en Afrique mettra fin au travail et au trafic des enfants, à la pauvreté, à l'exclusion et à l'exploitation. Alors que la conversation porte désormais sur la de reconstruction en mieux, les enfants et les jeunes pauvres doivent être prioritaires. L'année dernière, le G20 a promis tant de choses dans la réponse du COVID-19. Malheureusement, trop peu a été fait et cela continue de menacer la perte d'une génération. Au Burundi, 12 organisations se sont mises ensemble, dirigées par des jeunes au Burundi, qui se joignent aux jeunes militants, aux défenseurs des survivants et aux leaders étudiants du monde entier pour demander justice. Le prochain sommet du G20 est l'occasion pour nos dirigeants mondiaux d'arranger les choses. Nous exigeons que les ressources de notre monde donnent la priorité aux enfants les plus pauvres du Burundi, qui donne aussi la priorité aux enfants les plus pauvres de l'Afrique et aux enfants les plus pauvres du monde. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emebo. I'm going to read what Emebo read in English, if that's okay with you, Emebo. So Emebo is saying that in principle, children have the right to go to school without discrimination and must be protected against violence, abuse, and all forms of abuse and exploitation. However, that's not the actual reflection in Burundi, and certainly not Africa. Child labor and trafficking have accelerated in Africa in the past 8 years. We are now home to more child laborers than the rest of the world combined. 86.6 million child laborers live in sub-Saharan Africa. Shockingly, the ILO is predicting that without serious interventions, an additional 8.9 million children could be forced into child labor by the end of 2022 as a result of the global pandemic. If we don't swing into action, it would mean progress has reversed by a decade. Article 10 of the Labor Code in Burundi stipulates that the minimum age for employment is set at 16 years. However, our poorest children, as young as 5 years old, are excluded from education and are now employed as domestic servants. Extreme poverty with no access to social protection systems, including flaws, and the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the level of injustices. Yet, it is very clear that achieving a fair share of resources, policies, and social protection for every child in Burundi, and by and large Africa, will end child labor and trafficking, poverty, exclusion, and exploitation. As the conversation now focuses on building back better, poor children and young people must be prioritized. Last year, the G20 promised so much in COVID-19's response. Unfortunately, too little has been done. This in turn continues to threaten the loss of a generation. 12 youth-led organizations in Burundi are joining youth activists, survivor advocates, and student leaders across the world to call for justice. The upcoming G20 summit is an opportunity for our leaders to make things right. We demand our world's resources. Prioritize Burundi's poorest children, prioritize Africa's poorest children, prioritize the world's poorest children. Thank you. Thank you so much, Medna, Amiable, and Whitney. Quickly, if we have time, if you could say one sentence to G20 leaders on why they need to prioritize ending child labor, what would you say? In one sentence, why they need to prioritize child labor, what would you say, Medna? In one sentence, why do they need to prioritize ending child labor?
So there's definitely been a lack of social protection for all children all around the world, and they really need to fix that. Additionally, child labor is being used in their supply chains, and that needs to end because of that, children are not being able to get education, they're not getting the rights they need.
Thank you so much. Amiable, do you want to try in one sentence? Sorry, in one sentence, why do they need to prioritize ending child labor?
Thank you, Winnie. Excuse me, I will go to make it in French because I'm French speaker, as I said. And I think it will be good if I express myself in French. So sorry for those, I can just try to translate it in English after. So je pense que le temps s'accélère. Et si on ne change rien avec les années à venir, que ce soit 2 ou 3, on va voir que même ici au Burundi, les choses commencent à s'améliorer mal. Donc, on va voir trop d'enfants qui se trouvent dans les rues, trop d'enfants qui abandonnent l'école, et trop d'enfants qui seront traités comme des domestiques, et on n'aura rien à gagner. So, il est temps qu'on change. What I was saying is just time is time. We have no time to lose now, because if things are in Burundi now, we are seeing people, children, which are just left their school, left their home, and are going to be used and treated as slave in the homes as domestic. So we try to change, and it's time to change that. That's why we need the change from the up level to the social level. de l'Est. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Whitney, in 30 seconds, why should the G20 leaders prioritize ending child labor?
Okay. Children are the generation of tomorrow. They are the future leaders. So social protection policies are necessary to be put in place to endeavor that these children are educated so they can properly claim their spaces in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Whitney, Medna, and Amable. Now, let me bring Georgia on board. Georgia, over to you.
Thank you, Winnie, and thank you to Whitney, Amiable, and Medna. On to our next session, focusing on children and young people living in emergencies and protracted crises. Now, today, over 400 million children around the world live in conflict zones, and more than 33 million have been forcibly displaced, fleeing violence and climate disasters that they had no part in creating. It's hard to imagine a more vulnerable group, yet time and time again, the international community fails to protect their rights or safeguard their access to basic services such as health or education, a failure that puts them further at risk of more exploitation and abuse. This was exacerbated during the pandemic, when the richest countries not only closed their borders, but they seemed to close their eyes and their wallets to people living in crises that existed way before COVID-19. What should G20 countries be doing to ensure that every child and young person fleeing or living in conflict zones lives in safety and in dignity? So to explore this today, we have an amazing set of speakers. We have Henry Wright, just hoping to bring him up on the screen. There we go. Oh, there's Henry, and he's the youth representative for the Global Multilateral Fund on Education and Emergencies, Education Cannot Wait, and he's coming to us today from the US. And then we have Matthias. Matthias is on the executive board for the German Student Union, FSZ, who have been incredibly active and strong in supporting refugees in Afghanistan and Belarus. And finally, we have Ibrahim. Just going to mute you, Matthias. There's a little bit of background noise. There we go. No worries. And then we have Ibrahim as well, the executive director of the FRAD Foundation in Nigeria, who works with vulnerable populations in conflict-affected areas. Ibrahim, are you here? Ibrahim, you have to turn on your video. There you go. There you are. Okay, so to kick off this discussion today, we're going to bring up Henry. Over to you, Henry.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Thank you to Georgia and Winnie for moderating, and the 100 Million campaign for hosting such an important event. It's an honor to be alongside you all who have been fighting tirelessly for the rights of vulnerable young people worldwide. I'm going to try to speak quickly in the interest of time. The purpose of today's event is to raise our voices regarding the ways in which vulnerable young people have found their positions to become even more precarious as a result of the pandemic. As I'm sure you know, more than 150 million people have backslid into extreme poverty. Tens of millions of children could become child laborers in the next year. And displaced children and young adults are facing an increased risk of trafficking, violence, and sexual abuse. And those statistics don't begin to capture the less tangible aspects, less tangible impacts of the pandemic on young people, one of which is a stark increase in depression and anxiety, specifically among refugee children. At the same time, billionaires in the United States alone watched their wealth surge by over $1 trillion. Political power became even more entrenched, from Lebanon's sectarian oligarchy to Jinping's dictatorship in China. And almost every country in the world has seen an increase in income inequality due to the pandemic. All of these statistics are testaments to how our governments have failed us. At ECW, where I represent the youth, we have allocated funding throughout the pandemic, from Iraq to Afghanistan to Haiti, to fill in the gaps. But humanitarianism itself is an attempt to put Band-Aids on bullet wounds, to push pause on the rapid process of deterioration, when only governments can begin the process of healing and redistribution. As the world becomes more unequal and young people subsequently become more vulnerable, the question we have to ask ourselves is, when is it too late? When is it too late for the Syrian and Palestinian children who have spent years languishing in refugee camps in Jordan and Lebanon? When is it too late for the teenagers who hope to escape the ghettos of Brazil, who suddenly find themselves young adults trapped in the same system, while billionaires in the West continue to ascend? When is it too late for the tens of thousands of homeless youth on the streets of New York City, one of the wealthiest cities in the world? Governments must take massive action to address such stark inequities, but the answer lies somewhere on the horizon. I admit I don't know the answer. I don't know when it will be too late. I just hope for the futures of vulnerable young people worldwide that we don't find out. It falls to us as activists to ensure that we don't find out. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. And I'm always a little bit blown away by your eloquence, especially considering it is 7 a.m. in California right now. So that's even more impressive. Matthias, I'd love to invite you to the floor now to kind of give your perspective from FSZ in Germany and tell us a little bit about your views on this issue.
Yes, thank you, Georgia, and hello, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to speak at this amazing event. We as FZS, the German National Students Union, are very grateful for the amazing work that is being done by the 100 Million campaign. We share a common ground in the sense that we are fighting for a just world. We believe that an important, if not the most important part, is the free access to education for everybody. If we take a step back and look at what's happening in the world, we see a lot of heartbreaking developments that give the impression that we are moving away from a just world. For example, the takeover of the Taliban in Afghanistan, who now are chasing after and killing Afghans who work together with the help of Western countries in the fight for better living conditions in their country. Education has, for all intents and purposes, been pilloried in the Taliban's new Afghanistan. The extremist rulers have declared modern learning irrelevant, banned girls from going to school, and say the religious curriculum taught at madrasas is the only teachings the country needs. But we do not have to look far, because here in Europe, authoritarian rule is also been on the rise. Since the rigged presidential elections of Belarus in 2020, demonstrations have been taking place in Belarus to respect democratic principles and human rights. Many of the students participating in these protests have been sentenced to jail, and some even tortured. Belarusian authorities are trying to break down any form of dissent in every part of society. Many student activists live in exile in several European countries by now. Their safety, however, is not guaranteed. FZS strongly believes that G20 bear a historical responsibility to help those countries in need. Many of the G20 have profited from the centuries of colonization, which fed on exploitation of countries which nowadays are still underprivileged and recovering from the past. Additionally, the G20 member states have been responsible for many of the destabilized political situations in many regions, but also watched and done nothing while authoritarian and extremist rule came to power. In the last few years, we as FZS tried to raise awareness about the devastating situations in Belarus, Turkey, and most recently Afghanistan. through lobbying and talking to politicians and education stakeholders in Germany. And we try to find ways to help, be it in the terms of getting people evacuated from Afghanistan or to provide quick programs for students at risk. But at least in Germany, we are constantly facing political and bureaucratic barriers. The G20 has failed the general public and students by not providing rapid response strategies to help those in need. By not caring about what is happening in other countries, and by building a fortress, pushing back asylum seekers at the borders, often we observed diffusion of responsibility, with politicians pointing with the finger at each other concerning their responsibility while doing nothing themselves. The right to education and the right to asylum are human rights. We call on the G20 to strengthen democratic movements in repressive states, to respect human rights, and to open their borders to anyone who seeks asylum. Thank you.
I did not mean to make myself so big there. Thank you so much, Matthias. And it really, here at 100 Million, we're firm believers in the power of student unions and the student movement to fight not just for education, but to be on the forefront of human rights. And I've seen firsthand the incredible work that FSZ did in response to Afghanistan when many people turned their backs or said it couldn't be done. You guys just continued working, and full solidarity and credit to the next generation or the current generation of leaders in the movement. So I'm now happy to bring Ibrahim back up on the screen. Where have you gone? It looks like we may have a connection issue with Ibrahim. No, you're there, perfect. Ibrahim, I'm going to go over to you now to close out our final speech on this topic before hopefully asking you all a final question. So over to you, Ibrahim, if the internet is working. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Good, thank you very much. We are all here because we believe children have rights, and these rights are fundamental and have to be protected by all stakeholders from states, national, regional, and global leaders, and world richest countries. Growing up in Northeast Nigeria, specifically Borno State, the epicenter of the Boko Haram insurgency, I've seen a lot and I've been in pain watching how much displacement and great violation of rights children face. Millions of children in protracted crisis have been left with no form of social protection. Hundreds of millions of children globally are out of school with no access to healthcare, basic needs, and necessities of life. Going back to 2020, the impact of the COVID-19 have made the situation worse to conflict-affected population and unbearable to children and their caregivers. Let me speak on the context of Nigeria, how the pandemic have impacted various humanitarian services, thereby creating more gaps from the initial needs identified. Millions of children and their households depend on humanitarian assistance for survival in three most affected states of Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe, that is in Nigeria. Different organizations, both national organizations like Fraud Foundation, UN agencies, and INGOs are doing their best with little resources to see that the most vulnerable are reached, but limited resources are available due to funding constraint and security threat. The sad news is this: interventions have been put on hold or restricted to obey the government response policies on COVID-19 guidelines. The question to this is, who gives these people food in the IDP camps? Who attend to their medical needs? The answer is they are left on their own with little or no support to cope. The impact of this action on children is that millions of children are forced to go out to the streets to earn a living for themselves, doing hard labor to eat. Girls are forced to begin hawking in order to put food on their table. Millions of children across the world, especially low-income countries and conflict-affected regions, exposed to risks of abuse, exploitation, and neglect with no any support globally anywhere in the world. World leaders and other powerful countries have acted, but today, as an activist, I'm saying they have done too little. They have supported, but I'm still saying the support is not enough and have not reached the refugees. It has not reached the marginalized children. Their support has not reached the displaced children and youths. It has not reached those girls and boys living without any form of social protection or support. It has not yet reached those girls here in Nigeria and other countries of the world that have been married off during the COVID-19 pandemic by their parents and caregivers to cope with hardship and stress. Let me use a loud voice and count these action points that the COVID-19 pandemic have caused on children globally all over the world. Child labor have been in existence before the pandemic, but now have been on the increase, if not doubled. Maybe it was because there was no adequate support, especially for low-income countries, in order to cushion the effect and the impact of the pandemic for children and their families. The pandemic have resulted to more child abuse, and unfortunately, some of these abuses are carried out by the parents of these children. Although there is no single justifiable excuse one can give about this, but we all know it happens simply because there was no support. Youth are neglected with no form of support, which have made them resort to the use of negative coping mechanism to deal with stress. Millions of children could not go back to school after the pandemic, especially girls who are forced to early marriages. Millions of children passing through mental stress. In line with the above impact of the COVID-19, I am saying the world leaders have done something, but I'm still saying it again, is not enough. Jointly as global activists for children's rights, we are calling for more protection, education, nutrition, and healthcare support for children all over the world under this demand. These are our demands: robust social protection for children and youth living in emergency and protracted crisis, debt cancellation of low-income countries, increased financial support for refugees and displaced children and their families in emergencies. Let children have a voice in making decisions in what concerns them, and monitor projects and implementations that address their concerns. More funding for low-income countries to address the impact of COVID-19, especially on children and youth in emergency. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate this to the G20 and other global leaders, that they must ask themselves, have we done enough to support and work with governments of low-income countries and countries suffering from protracted crises like Nigeria, Afghanistan, etc.? I'm saying to the G20 and all global leaders, I know you can do it. That is why I'm asking. We know you can do it. That is why we are asking. And the children know you have the capacity. That is why we are asking for them and for us. It's just a fair share of our future that we are asking of. As our slogan in Fraud Foundation always is, building resilience, leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Ibrahim. That's it, perfect. So we're running a little bit out of time, but it was such quality content in all of your speeches. I really have a burning question that I'd love to put to you all, and if you could kind of answer in a very, very short way, that would be brilliant. But you've all touched on it in your different speeches, but I'm wondering how you think the COVID-19 crisis has impacted your country's political support for refugees, and if so, why? So do you think the pandemic and the lockdowns and the global nature of this has had an impact on the political support for refugees? I'm going to go in the order we went in. So Henry, the US, do you think COVID has impacted your likelihood to resettle refugees, or etc.?
Unfortunately not. I think the United States has always had very isolationist leanings. And I think considering the lack of refugee voices and stories in the global media, there's been very little discussion of how the pandemic has impacted refugees and vulnerable children. So I think, unfortunately, at least from the United States, I don't think there's been a change in perspective. the conversation actually has centered, at least in the news, on the space race between Elon Musk and Richard Branson. So I think that speaks for itself where our eyes are at the moment.
Yeah. And Matthias, I'm going to go to you next. And, you know, we share a similar, we're both in Europe, and something that I've witnessed here in the UK is countries, as Henry was saying, have become quite isolationist. They're focused on their national protection, and that's been a big theme of the COVID crisis. And at what expense does that nationalism lead to, with people needing to come in and need shelter and safety?
I think it's a kind of difficult question to answer because, as has already been mentioned, there has been a huge focus on other things during the last few years. But I think the impact has been, yeah, as you said, it's like a more protectionist sense that has coming up and rise, and people thinking more in a nationalist sense. We've seen it in Europe, even like different countries closing down their borders and trying to protect themselves from everybody who was trying to get in. But I think there's like especially an effect on maybe Asian refugees concerning the whole connection with coronavirus and
racism.
And racism, exactly. And that's how it was mainly affected, like an effect that was really visible during the media, through the media.
Thank you. And Ibrahim, and you mentioned it in your speech about during the lockdowns that you have vulnerable and internally displaced people within your country. How has COVID and the lockdowns affected those populations?
Okay, the pandemic have immensely actually affected the internally displaced persons in the three conflict-affected states of Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe. As we all know, there are more than 8.1 million people that are highly vulnerable and completely depending on humanitarian assistance. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was this total lockdown of all the 36 states in Nigeria, and there is this logistic arrangement by World Food Program, that's WFP, whereby food items are being shipped to these internally displaced camps. So this lockdown have technically denied those people access to food. This lockdown have technically denied this population of people access to distribution sites where they go on monthly basis in order for them to collect their food rations and the rest of them. Example, we have a camp, and the camp is occupied by, let's assume, 100,000 population. And now there is now a movement restriction. The medical workers cannot go to the clinics to work. That is to say, if there is any medical emergency in that particular camp, that person is there for himself. So the impact of the COVID-19 cannot just be overemphasized. It has actually immensely contributed to the increase in needs of the vulnerable population. Already they are vulnerable. With the coming of COVID-19, they become more vulnerable than before. There is already hunger, and now we say there is no movement for logistics, for trailers, for all those big trucks for them to transport food.
Yeah.
What are they surviving on? So this is the action, this is the reaction. It pushed children out to the streets.
Yeah.
Parents cannot provide food. Children have to go to the communities, hawk. Children have to go to the communities to beg, street begging and rest of them, in order for them to get something for them to eat and for their daily needs. Thank you.
This discussion that the global crisis that should have pulled us all together as a global community has actually entrenched our division, which is very sad. Winnie, I'm going to bring it back to you for our final discussion of the day, but thank you so much to our speakers in this session.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Matthias, and thank you, Ibrahim. I am excited to be introducing our final discussion today on children and young people denied their right to education, an injustice that interconnects with so many others and is at the very heart of the fight for a fair share. there has been staggering inequalities in access to education, both globally and within countries, for generations, and COVID-19 both entrenched and increased this. At the height of the pandemic, school closure, over 1 billion young learners were affected, and over 400 million were unable to access online learning due to the huge digital divide. Those most impacted were children and young people already facing systematic discrimination, such as girls and young women, people with disabilities, and those living in rural areas. If we are to build back better at all, ensuring education for all must be at the forefront of these efforts. To share their thoughts on this with us today is Linda Nakaiba, Girls Back to School Campaign Lead and Raising Teenagers Uganda. Our next speaker is the amazing Ifran Mangera, who is a Youth Activism Program Manager at Ahmed Kathrada Foundation in South Africa, the only African country here, and also the only African country to be represented in the G20.
So I just need to come on just to say that Linda has been in the field today working on her education projects, and she's unable to join us live because her connection is too weak. So instead we're going to play a pre-recorded video of her speech that she very smartly sent us in advance. So I'm just going to play that now.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nakaiba Lelinda Eunice. I am the Girls Back to School Lead Campaign Coordinator for Uganda. I also work with Raising Teenagers Uganda, an NGO keeping girls in school as well as fighting and ending child marriages. Well, I would like to thank 100 Million Campaign for organizing such powerful events and giving young people and youth an opportunity to hold leaders accountable for their failure to take action and doing what they're supposed to be doing. When we talk of a fair share now, we mean opportunity, we mean equity, we mean accountability, we mean action, we mean inclusion, we mean the most marginalized accessing quality services, but most importantly, we mean human rights. Unfortunately, and I can attest to this, that we are failing the children of our world. We are not thinking about their welfare, education, health, nor are we taking deliberate action to transform the situation for the better. I have been running the Girls Back School campaign for a year and a half now, and more than 14,000 girls have been reported pregnant, with little or no hope of returning to school. Their education risks to be halted by the lack of strong educational policies, ensuring continued learning for expectant girls and those that have given birth. The school learning environment isn't favorable either, due to the gender stereotypes, lack of counselors to cater for the psychosocial needs of the children, lack of catch-up classes, lack of nursing rooms, stigma, to mention but a few. As the Girls Back School campaign, we were able to support girls that were pregnant with funding out of pocket to remain in school, to return to school, and finish their final examinations. But we can do so little with the limited resources. This is work the government of Uganda and world leaders should be doing. It's not lost on me about the number of children with disabilities who have been left behind in e-learning because of the inequalities in technology. This has widened the already existing digital divide and has pushed the most marginalized children furthest behind. We have been having conversations on building back better and equal, leaving no one behind, and other catchy phrases, but there has been little effect to it. In fact, most world leaders are currently talking about financing education. Surprisingly, no one is explaining where the money is going to come from and who is actually responsible. Financing education means little when all there is to it is words. We demand tangible solutions and interventions. We need to be deliberate and practical about delivering for children, from lip service to action, because that's where impact is. I therefore call on the G20 world leaders to put money where their words are. The G20 leaders need to support lower income countries like Uganda achieve a fair share of tax revenues to fund education, because currently domestic financing for education isn't possible given the existing debt burden. Invest in technology that is accessible, affordable, and inclusive of persons with disabilities, but most importantly, fund projects and programs aiming at behavior change in the community in regards to ending violence against children. For example, fund projects fighting sexual, gender-based violence, fund projects fighting child labor, because these are key factors that are keeping children behind. We can never achieve sustainable development when the children, who are actually our future, are being sidelined. I demand for a fair share for every child.
Such an amazing video from Linda. Ifan, over to you.
Thank you, speaker. Absolutely brilliant, absolutely amazing. Friends, activists, comrades, leaders, fellow Africans, youth formations from across the globe, I greet you in the name of peace and unity. We are indeed living through a trying and testing time, as with many that have come before us. These times where we bear witness to atrocities happening next to us, in front of us on a daily basis, where we're seeing the value of human life being reduced to absolutely nothing. Today, I speak to you about the topic of young people being excluded from education and how far we are yet to achieve the SDG 4 of achieving quality education. Over 1/5 of young people between 6 and 11 are out of school. Over 1/3 between the age of 12 and 14 are out of school. 60% of youth between 15 and 17 are not in school. And these stats are very outdated in comparison to what COVID has done to education systems across the continent of Africa. There are many reasons and many different forms of exclusion that are happening. And I think as an activist myself, we have witnessed many of it from a community-based level where many of our youth clubs and youth activists operate and live. Schools have been closed where no teaching and learning has taken place. Issues of learning time lost, of curriculum not being covered, of mental health being such a huge challenge to young people, where we're seeing the effect of young people dealing with depression, dealing with anxiety, but also the high rate of suicide that is starting to emerge. There's huge limits to the access to technologies. And I think many of the previous speakers that I've listened to already have spoken to this digital divide and what it means. Infrastructure continues to be a challenge for African countries in particular, where projects, campaigns to get schools built, to get libraries built, to get community infrastructure in place to support learners, to support communities are not being there or have been not built based on issues of corruption, of mismanagement, and so on as well. In addition, I think the generational divide of Africans, and speaking as a South African, the legacy of apartheid and colonialism still affects us today. That is of a value system that has been passed down continuously over time. Speaking to that value system is also how the issue of language continues to exclude young people from accessing education. Many young people access school but cannot comprehend the work that is being done, the learning and teaching modes that have been adopted in particular schools. Infrastructure as well speaks to the issue of sanitation as well as transportation that continues to be a barrier to learning and accessing education. We know many organizations in South Africa, Equal Education, Section 27, and many others continue to work on trying to mitigate those things and holding people to account. But again, this isn't sufficient because as a government, as a collective, we still require lots more investment into ensuring that these projects can be implemented. Many people are excluded out of issues of conflict across the globe, but looking at Africa and the threat to democracy by armed conflict, particularly now looking at areas like Sudan, where military coups continue to plague our continent. Africa still bears the legacy of high rates of poverty and inequality, and this is prevalent today, where those who have access to funds and to a different means of life can buy their way into a good education and thereafter leaving those behind. We cannot allow in 2021 young people being excluded based on the fact that they cannot afford an education. Education should be accessible for all people, for all young people, regardless of who they are, and where they come from. In addition to this, children with disabilities have been hit the hardest. When we speak to COVID and the issues of COVID, we also recognize that while some schools could afford to go digital to continue with their learning program, many couldn't access infrastructure. They don't even have basics like laptops, like cell phones, and so on. And even in certain conditions where they do have that access, issues of electricity shortages. South Africa has a huge energy problem. Yesterday, our country started off the matric examinations, and as a result of issues within our power utilities, there were huge blackouts across the country. This bodes really bad for our progress as a continent and as a nation, well, speaking about South Africa, but continues to exclude young people from achieving the best of their ability to the best of their abilities. Addition to that is girls' education, where young women continue to bear the brunt. On top of all these things, are even heightened in their exclusion from education access. Thus, through period poverty, thus through limited access for other demands that are placed, whether it's cultural, traditional demands, and so on. These are indeed challenging times. And I know I only have 4 minutes to speak, so I will be wrapping up. It was Samora Machel who said, solidarity is not an act of charity, but it is an act of unity between allies fighting on different terrains toward the same objective. And the foremost of these objectives is to aid in the development of humanity to the highest level possible. If we as young people across the globe can act and build our movement as solidarity activists, as intersectional activists, recognizing the links between issues of climate justice, education access, issues of menstrual health, sexual and reproductive health, to all these other issues that we are faced with, we will be able to overcome this. As a young person, I know South Africa is part of the G20. And my call once more is that we really require action more than words. We've heard, I grew up in democracy. We've continuously heard all these stories, all these commitments that have been made, all these different things that have been signed towards granting access and hoping to achieve access by a particular year, by a particular time. We know that these are not possible. They haven't been met, and they continue to just be false promises. How can we continue when this is the case? So my position is that young people have to mobilize as a collective, have to work together as a collective. And it begins by recognizing that humanity is all about collective, not individualistic aspirations and interests. If we put the interest of all ahead of our own, we will be able to progress forward. So in closing, I'd like to say that let's start from the community level upwards, apply pressure on those countries, on those governments who really have to commit not just funding, but continuous support to organizations, campaigns, and to people and activists like us on the ground who are facing and bearing the brunt to deal with these many issues that I've highlighted today. Thank you so much, Program Director.
Thank you so much, Ifan. And one thing that you have said that I also agree with is the need for we as young people to mobilize as a collective. There is so much power in solidarity, and we continue to see what we can achieve when we work in solidarity. So as we are wrapping up, and I know we are behind time, just one question to you because Linda is not here. In 1 minute, what are the main actions that the international community must take to ensure every child goes back to school?
Okay, I think the first and foremost is that the commitment to opening up and in giving more funding to the global south, who are continuously suffering, and particularly African countries who really have been ravaged economically by the pandemic. When I speak economically, it ties to education because young people are affected the most within that dynamic as well. If you don't have a stable economy, you can't grow and you aren't able to. I know somebody spoke about portions of budgets. allocated to education. South Africa is one. A huge part of our GDP and revenue is pushed into education, but it's not enough. So I think that's the one area where their commitments need to be practical. They need to be supportive of exchanges where they can also contribute towards a very robust change and supporting not just governments, but NGOs, youth networks, youth movements who are working on the ground, where they can start recognizing and implementing change. A huge challenge that I think needs to be recognized by all of us is that, yes, on paper, we have different things signed. We agree that things need to be done. But when it comes down to implementation, somehow or the other, the money disappears. So that commitment to accountability mechanisms, as well as an anti-corruption framework, is what's necessary, because that will allow us to ensure that regardless of who is at the helm of government, services and education is then accessed by all on the ground.
You brought me on, Winnie, when I was just like staring like in full solidarity and admiration. So thank you for not warning me. I was coming back on the screen.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ifan. Thank you so much. And also for the work you're doing to defend the right to education for the most marginalized and vulnerable young people.
Amanda, thank you so much. I'd like, perhaps if you give me a second, yesterday was Oliver Tambo's birth anniversary, and it was Tambo who said, for those who don't know, Oliver Tambo was an anti-apartheid activist, huge influence within the movement across the globe. His quote was that the children of any nation are its future. A country, movement, and a person that does not value its youth and children does not deserve its future. So for all those sitting in positions of power, if you're not listening to us, if you're not going to be able to act on what we have put forward, you do not deserve our future, and you do not deserve our support. So thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a
Thank you.
Perfect line to bring us to our close and our own call to action.
So, Georgia, before you go to our call of action, let me just recap. But ideally, will I be able to put it in 4 minutes what our amazing speakers have shared with us today on this platform?
Nope.
I am so honored. You know, today again, I've just been reminded of how powerful we as young people are. That youth activists, survivor advocates, and student leaders, they're able to do so much in their different communities. And while at it, they're still the strongest voices out here just calling for accountability from our leaders. And even throughout this session, we've had phrases like, the actions are not enough, yet we are aware that the world has enough. We have enough resources. We youth activists again have highlighted the injustices, the inequalities, from education, from crisis in Sudan to Afghanistan, from refugee children, displaced people, IDPs, child laborers, those at risk of being trafficked. And in all this, in one voice, I know we are agreeing that our leaders have to take responsibility. The idea of pointing out fingers and leaders not wanting to do enough, we will not agree with that. So we will continue to push for accountability, but again, in one voice, we are calling on the G20, the leaders from the world's richest country. Please give the poor children their fair share of resources. Thank you so much. Over to you, Georgia.
Well, I'm just going to respond to what you were saying there, Winnie. I think one of the things for me in this event is the clear anger that has come through as well, and just being the false promises that Irfan mentioned at the end is just we're getting sick of them. And to reference what Henry said as well, in his country, the whole news cycle has been on two rich white men's race to conquer the moon, when there are millions and hundreds of millions of children denied their basic rights. It's laughable, and it should make us all very angry. And that's why, we are calling on the G20, the self-proclaimed leaders of the response, the richest economies in the world, to give us our fair share and to enable every single one of us to have our right to education, our right to freedom, and our right to safety. And for every single child, but especially the most vulnerable, quality education is not just a right, it is a complete lifeline. It is the springboard for liberation that will set the path of a different world. And when we are toiling in the fields, when we are working in factories, in mines, we cannot learn. If we are locked down due to lack of healthcare or vaccines in this pandemic we've seen, our classrooms are empty. And when informal settlements or IDP or refugee camps are excluded from public services, we're never going to be able to access our right to learning. So ahead of this and ahead of the summit this weekend, we've prepared a joint letter to deliver to the G20 in advance of their summit. Now, it has already been signed by over 20 youth organisations around the world, many regional student union platforms representing millions of other fellow young people. And we welcome all of you watching today, all of you who've joined as speakers, as audience members, those who have said hi in solidarity in the chat. We welcome you to sign on to this. And you can email myself or Winnie, and the statement is a little bit too long to be applicable to be able to share my screen on here. But please email myself or Winnie if you would like to see a copy of this statement and to add your organisational solidarity to it. This statement is calling for social protection, mainly for education, and to support the children who have been forcibly displaced during and long before COVID. When we look at the solution to this human rights disaster for young people, we know that investment in social protection is critical to ending poverty, to ending child labour, increasing school enrolment, and a lifeline for families who have been forcibly displaced. 90% of children in low-income countries live without any form of social protection. And yet in Europe, 80% of children already have it. In fact, in my country, here in the UK, 100% of children are covered by social protection, and that figure falls just 12% for the entirety of Africa. That is outrageous, and it needs to change. We will direct tweets and emails this letter to G20 members and the G20 Sherpas, and the more of us who add our voices, the more of us who tweet and email, the more pressure we can put on decision makers who are holding back the end to this pandemic and the end to the injustices the passionate speakers here today have shared. So that kind of finally ends our session. And I just want to share again, thank you for joining us, and huge solidarity and admiration to all of you. So yeah, thank you very much.